A quiet tale of solitude and shifting seasons. I was 42 when I truly began to feel the size of my house. It stood quietly at the edge of the city. A modest two-story home with white shutters and a garden that had long stopped blooming. To a stranger, it might have seemed like a peaceful life. Predictable. Safe.
Evenenbievel.
But inside, the silence had begun to settle into the walls. There was a time when this home had carried the weight of joyful noise. The hum of weekend breakfasts, the clatter of small feet across wooden floors, the warm laughter that used to float up the stairs like music. But that was a different season of my life. A version of me that felt like a photograph left too long in the sun. Now each room felt just a little too large. A little too still. A little too aware of my presence as I moved through them alone. I had built a life many would call stable. A good career. A quiet neighborhood. Enough to live comfortably and privately. But emotional stillness is not the same as peace. Peace is chosen. Stillness, sometimes, is just what's left after the color drains out of the days. I had grown used to it. The way one grows used to waking up early even on weekends. Or how silence becomes background music after years of living without interruptions. But every now and then, especially in the evening when the sky dims and the air feels heavier, I could feel it, that soft ache of missing something I could no longer name. It wasn't just loneliness. Loneliness is easy to name. This was quieter, like a memory that never fully fades, just becomes part of the wallpaper. Eventually, I made a practical decision, or so I told myself. The lower level of the house, once used as a guest suite, had its own entrance and kitchenette. It made sense to rent it out, help with the bills, fill some of the space, make the house feel less echoey. I wasn't looking for companionship, just a presence, just enough to remind me that something still moved beyond my walls, that somewhere in the house, a light might turn on that I didn't switch, that a door might close softly, not because of wind, but because someone else had returned home. It was, in hindsight, my first quiet gesture toward change, so subtle I almost didn't notice I had made it. A quiet presence beneath my roof. His name was Lucas, 28 years old, tall in that unassuming way, like someone who'd grown quickly but learned to shrink himself out of politeness. He introduced himself with a soft smile, handed me his documents without fuss, and asked very little. A young architect, he said, working mostly from home. Quiet, respectful, and most importantly, not looking for conversation. Exactly what I had hoped for. Lucas moved into the downstairs apartment on a rainy Tuesday. I remember because the sound of his footsteps on the porch felt like the first ripple in water that had long lain still. He brought only a few pieces of furniture, mostly clean-lined and functional. His books were stacked in neat towers, his clothes in a small suitcase that he carried himself, twice up and down the stairs, without a word of complaint. In the days that followed, I hardly noticed him. He came and went at regular hours, never loud, never lingering. If we passed each other in the stairwell, there would be a nod, a polite smile, sometimes a brief exchange of words. Weather, work, parcels mistakenly delivered to the wrong mailbox. But always brief, always wrapped in the kind of courtesy that keeps lives neatly apart. It was the kind of arrangement I'd imagined. Two strangers sharing a building, keeping their worlds intact and separate. And yet, there was something about his presence that subtly shifted the air in the house. Not dramatically, just enough to notice, like the faint scent of soap left behind after someone passes you in a hallway, or the sound of a door closing gently downstairs when you're sitting alone upstairs, reminded suddenly that you're not as alone as you thought. Lucas never intruded, never asked questions, but he noticed things. Once he helped me lift a box of groceries when my hands were full. No unnecessary chatter, just a quiet gesture and a return to his day. Another time, I found the broken step on the porch had been repaired. Not with tape or nails, but properly mended with precision. He never mentioned it. I only knew it was him because no one else came and went, and I began to feel it, that his presence, while distant, carried a quiet respect. Not the kind that asks to be acknowledged, but the kind that makes space feel a little less empty just by being steady. Still, I kept the boundaries, not out of coldness but because I had learned, sometimes painfully, how necessary they are. We were not friends. We were not companions. Just two individuals, each carrying their quiet, each moving through their lives like parallel lines, close but never touching. And I believed it would always stay that way. But life, I've come to realize, doesn't always honor the lines we draw. Sometimes it whispers instead, and waits for the moment we're soft enough to listen. When care doesn't speak but still reaches you. First, it was nothing more than coincidence. A passing moment in the hallway as I struggled with a stack of documents. Lucas appeared, didn't say a word, just stepped forward, took half the load from my arms, and walked quietly behind me to the kitchen.
No conversasten.
No attempt at familiarity. Just a nod before he turned back toward the stairs. And then came the coffee. It had been a long day. One of those days when the weight of everything, work, solitude, the stillness of a house with too much memory, feels heavier than usual. I returned home late, expecting nothing, wanting only silence. But there, resting on the welcome mat, was a small paper cup, still warm. Taped to it, a note no bigger than a receipt, black.
No sugar.
Hope that's right. No name. No message beyond that. It was a gesture so small it could have been dismissed. But I didn't. I couldn't, because it reached something in me that hadn't been reached in a very long time. Not since the days when someone else used to pour the second cup of coffee without asking how I liked it, because they already knew. After that, I began noticing the little things. A doormat that had been swept dry after a night of rain. A flickering light bulb replaced before I even found the time to climb the ladder. The plant I forgot to water in the hallway somehow still blooming. Lucas never mentioned any of it, and I never asked, but each gesture, quiet and unobtrusive, felt like a small thread being woven between us. Not a rope, not a bridge, just a thread barely visible but strong enough to feel. And then I changed too. I began to linger near the hallway window in the evenings, pretending to adjust the blinds but really listening for his footsteps. I began to greet him with something more than a nod, sometimes a soft smile, sometimes a small good night, as if testing the limits of the space between us. I even began paying more attention to myself. A different sweater, a gentler shade of lipstick. Not because I expected anything, but because something inside me had begun to remember what it felt like to be seen, to be noticed, not loudly, not publicly, but with care. Quiet care. And yet, we still hadn't crossed any lines. No late-night conversations. No shared meals. Only the growing awareness that something had shifted in the silence between us. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something smaller but, in a way, more tender. The feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, someone in this house knew you existed, and silently chose to be kind with that knowledge. When boundaries begin to blur, there was no dramatic shift, no sudden moment of realization, no line crossed, only a slow, barely noticeable unraveling, like winter giving way to spring 1 degree at a time. I started waiting for him, not consciously at first, but I began to time my return from work around the hour Lucas usually arrived home. I would pause by the window near the stairs, pretending to check for mail that never came, Sometimes I'd step outside with a light shawl I didn't need, just for the possibility of catching a glimpse of him returning, his keys in one hand, his expression calm and unreadable. It was never about wanting something to happen. It was about how his presence, quiet and steady, had begun to color the edges of my life. Subtle, but undeniable. There was one evening I remember clearly. I passed by his door and caught the faint scent of sandalwood and paper. The kind of scent that reminds you someone is creating something just on the other side of the wall. And in that moment I felt a gentle envy. Not of what he had, but of the way he occupied space without taking too much of it. How he moved through the world like someone who had learned to live gently, even with his own weight. I started paying attention to myself again. I added honey to my tea, lit candles in the hallway, chose softer clothes on weekends, looser fabrics that draped instead of shaped. I wasn't dressing for him. I was dressing for a version of myself I hadn't seen in years, the one who still believed in warmth, in the grace of small intentions. But still we said nothing. A nod, a smile, a soft good evening, that was all. But something always lingered in the air between us. Something unspoken, not forbidden, just too fragile to name. And isn't that how most changes begin? Not with noise, but with stillness, with the small, slow softening of a heart that had forgotten what it meant to hope for someone else's nearness, even if only in passing. By then, I no longer thought of Lucas as the tenant. I thought of him as Lucas, the man downstairs, the one who never tried to enter my world, but somehow, without knowing it, had already left gentle fingerprints across it. How storms sometimes carry answers. The first rain of the season came quietly, unannounced, as most turning points do. It wasn't the violent kind that crashes against windows. It was soft, constant, and deeply lonely. Like a song played in a room no one else was in. The electricity cut off around 8:30. The house fell into immediate silence. No hum of the fridge. No clicking of the thermostat. Just the steady drum of water outside and the flickering dance of a single candle on my kitchen table. I wasn't afraid. I had lived through worse storms, but that night something about the stillness unsettled me. Not in a threatening way, but in the way loneliness does when it finds a quiet crack to slip through. I brewed ginger tea, a ritual really, one I'd clung to since the years I started spending evenings alone. It's warm, familiar, a comfort I don't have to explain to anyone. Without thinking, I poured a second cup. I stared at it for a moment, steam curling upward, vanishing into the dark. I didn't need 2 cups. I never did. But for some reason that night, I placed the second cup outside Lucas's door, on the small mat where he left his shoes neatly aligned, always facing outward. No note.
No knack, just there.
Just presence. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. I had returned to my table, the tea growing cooler in my hand, the candle burning lower. And then, a knock. Soft. Almost hesitant. I opened the door and there he was, Lucas, dressed in a dark sweater, hair slightly damp, cheeks flushed from the mist. In his hand, a bottle of red wine opened, 2 glasses tucked carefully beneath his arm. He looked at me for a moment, then said in that even, calm voice of his, "I thought maybe tonight isn't a night to drink tea alone." And just like that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way the air changes before spring, when it's still cold but you know warmth is coming. I stepped aside. No words. No invitation. Just the quiet widening of a doorway. When 2 silhouettes sit just close enough. We didn't speak much at first. Lucas sat across from me on the low couch, his sweater still carrying the faint scent of rain. I poured the tea into smaller cups, though he'd brought wine. Somehow, both sat comfortably on the table between us. Two versions of comfort, two ways of arriving at the same warmth. The only light came from the candle on the windowsill. It flickered gently, casting gold along the floor, softening every edge of the room and of us. Our conversation moved slowly, not out of awkwardness but care, like two people walking across a glass bridge, mindful not to step too hard. He told me about a design project he'd walked away from, not because he failed but because one day he looked at the sketches and realized none of them were his. He said it in a voice that didn't seek pity, only truth. I shared how for years I brewed 2 cups of coffee each morning, out of habit, or maybe hope, but only one was ever touched. The other sat cooling on the countertop until it became a kind of ritual morning, a private acknowledgement of absence. He didn't respond with advice, and I didn't expect him to. There was something sacred in just listening, in sitting with another person's story without needing to fix it. At some point, I leaned forward to refill his glass, and our hands brushed, just briefly, but in the quiet of the room, in the rhythm of the rain, it felt louder than it was. My eyes lifted to his. His gaze didn't shift, didn't flinch. It simply held me there, like a pause between 2 notes in a song that might never finish. We were sitting close now, not touching, but close enough that our breaths could find each other in the air. And still we said nothing, because words would have felt too loud for what that moment was. It wasn't desire, not in the way movies frame it. It was recognition. 2 people, both tired in different ways, seeing something soft and real in each other. Lucas leaned slightly closer, his eyes asking but never demanding. There was no pressure in him, just presence, a quiet waiting. I didn't kiss him. Instead, I gently rested my hand atop his, fingertips light, almost unsure. Not to invite more but to say, "This is enough." And he understood. He pulled back. Not with disappointment but with reverence, as if the silence between us now held more meaning than anything we could have spoken aloud. Some moments are meant to stay intact. We sat for a while longer after that, 2 people surrounded by dim candlelight and the steady breath of rain outside. Neither of us spoke. There were still 2 half-filled glasses on the table, still warmth in the room, but something had shifted. Not a change in mood, not even in direction, just a quiet, unspoken agreement. This was the edge of something we would not cross, not because we didn't feel the pull, but because we both understood. Sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones you protect by leaving them whole and untouched. Lucas didn't offer apologies. I didn't feel the need to explain. What had passed between us wasn't a mistake. It was a moment. One of those rare, tender instants when 2 people meet each other not with their hands or lips, but with full awareness, with kindness, with restraint. And then he stood. He picked up the bottle of wine, left the glasses behind, and met my eyes one last time before heading toward the stairs. No promises, no next time, just that same quiet presence I had come to recognize in him from the beginning. Except this time, there was something softer in his expression, a kind of respect that's only possible between 2 people who have seen each other's vulnerability and chosen not to take advantage of it. After he left, I sat in the silence, not empty, not aching, just full, in a way that didn't ask for more. I cleared the cups, blew out the candle, went to bed with a heart that wasn't fluttering, but wasn't heavy either, just still. And that, I've come to learn, is a kind of peace, when nothing is said but everything is understood. The next morning, the sky was startlingly clear, as if the rain had never fallen, as if the night before had simply dissolved into mist. Sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, brushing against the corners of my home, making everything look ordinary. But I knew better. Something had shifted. Not in the furniture, not in the walls, but in me. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and reached out of habit for a second cup, then paused, smiled, just one, and this time it didn't feel like absence, felt like choice. I sipped slowly, letting the silence settle again. Not the hollow kind, but the kind that lives in places where something meaningful has passed through. Later that morning, I crossed paths with Lucas on the stairs. He nodded as he always did. There was nothing new in his expression. No hesitation, no discomfort. But his eyes met mine with something rare. A quiet knowing, a respect for what had been shared, and an even deeper respect for the line we had chosen not to cross. We didn't speak of the candlelight or the wine or the way our hands had hovered close. There was no need, because there are some moments that don't need to be revisited. They only need to be held. Gently, privately, like something sacred, not claimed, not named, just remembered. I returned to my morning rhythm, emails, errands, light chores, but the air in the house felt different, clearer. Not because anything had changed between us outwardly, but because I had been reminded that even in stillness, even in solitude, something human and beautiful can still reach you. It doesn't always need to become a story. Sometimes it's enough for it to remain a memory. Not everything meaningful has to last. Some things are complete simply because they were felt fully, even for just one evening. And so, with the sunlight spilling softly across the floor, I whispered a quiet thank you to the morning, not because I gained something, but because I hadn't lost anything, and that in itself felt like healing. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The narrative was created for emotional storytelling and reflective purposes only. It does not depict real individuals, relationships, or experiences. All characters, names, and settings are entirely fictional and used to explore human connection, personal boundaries, and emotional healing in a respectful and thoughtful manner. This content is intended to offer gentle insight and quiet companionship through story. Viewer discretion is advised for those navigating personal loss or emotional transitions.